Welcome to China Reality. After Zheng Xiaoyu took office, he said he would regulate things. Local authorities were no longer allowed to approve drugs. So later, there was a campaign to convert local standards into national standards. The idea of converting local standards into national standards was correct. Local governments should not arbitrarily approve drugs. In principle, moving from local standards to national standards should mean raising the standards. However, Zheng Xiaoyu did not raise the standards. Whoever paid him, he approved their drugs. In 2004 alone, he approved more than 10,000 new drugs. You should know that in the same year, 2004, the US FDA approved only 113 drugs. In fact, the FDA typically approves only dozens of drugs per year. But Zheng Xiaoyu approved over 10,000 in a single year. What did this lead to? It led to many drugs being approved that were essentially fake. Even if they weren't fake, their quality varied wildly. All sorts of unqualified people got approvals. Then, in 2006, problems began to emerge. In Harbin, a pharmaceutical factory produced something, what was it called? Some kind of mycin injection. It resulted in widespread adverse reactions, and some people even died. Soon after, there was another very famous incident involving a drug called Xinfu. This was also an injection produced by a pharmaceutical company in southern China. After infusion, many patients developed kidney failure, and dozens of people lost their lives. Then, in 2007, Zheng Xiaoyu was arrested. In May 2007, he was sentenced to death by the Beijing Intermediate People's Court with immediate execution. Zheng Xiaoyu was stunned. He was a minister of all official, yet he was directly sentenced to death and executed immediately. On the day before his execution, he wrote a letter of repentance. Although he claimed he had not directly killed people for money, his actions were essentially equivalent to doing so. In fact, the court determined that the amount of money he took was not very large, just over 6.4 million yuan. However, his actions caused endless long-term damage to China's pharmaceutical industry. There were over 7,000 pharmaceutical factories in China. Each factory held dozens of drug approval documents. With approval, they could produce drugs, but the quality of these drugs was completely unknown. Later, in 2016, the State Council introduced a remedial measure called consistency evaluation. What is consistency evaluation? For example, there is an original drug, Bayer's enteric-coated aspirin tablets. If you want to produce aspirin, you must conduct a bioequivalent study comparing your aspirin with Bayer's. In other words, you must prove that your aspirin has roughly similar dissolution rates and curves. The requirement is about 80%. How many manufacturers in China produce aspirin? Unfortunately, there are 246. Just think about it. Over 200 manufacturers producing aspirin, and all must pass consistency evaluation. I don't know how many passed, but nationwide, across all drugs, only 1,988 manufacturers passed consistency evaluation. Now, think about it. Out of tens of thousands of drugs in the past, only 1,988 remain. What does that show? It shows that consistency evaluation is, to some extent, addressing the consequences of the rapid, unchecked expansion during the Zheng Xiaoyu era. Of course, some people say that consistency evaluation itself has issues. Why? Because many Chinese pharmaceutical companies are not professional. They don't even have laboratories. They cannot conduct bioequivalence studies themselves, so they outsource these studies to third-party companies. These third-party companies specialize in conducting experiments, including clinical trials and bioequivalence studies. Bioequivalence studies are expensive. Some say it costs 30 million yuan to complete one drug study. Others claim they can guarantee approval for 8 million yuan. In reality, this is essentially bribery of the drug regulatory authorities. As for whether bribery occurs or whether data is manipulated, anyone familiar with the Chinese system would believe it certainly happens. It's impossible that it doesn't. The regulatory authority holds too much power. As a surgeon, the issue I feel most strongly about is muscle relaxants. As everyone knows, laparoscopic surgery requires general anesthesia. At this time, muscle relaxants are needed. The patient cannot breathe on their own and relies on a ventilator. The abdominal muscles are relaxed, and by insufflating carbon dioxide, we create space in the abdominal cavity for surgery. If the muscle relaxant is ineffective, the consequence is obvious. The abdominal space is very small, and the operation becomes difficult. The camera is frequently bumped and becomes blurry. Surgeons may even interfere with each other during the procedure. So how poor are these centrally procured muscle relaxants? Both anesthesiologists and surgeons share the same experience. In the past, we barely needed to communicate with anesthesiologists. During surgery, one dose of muscle relaxant was enough. But now, when we encounter small working space or poor visibility, the first thing I check is the insufflator pumps gas into the abdomen until a preset pressure is reached. For example, 15 mmHg, then it stops. But because the muscle relaxant is not effective, the patient's abdominal wall keeps contracting intermittently, causing fluctuations in pressure. The insufflator thinks the pressure is sufficient and stops supplying gas. However, after contraction, the abdominal wall relaxes again. When it relaxes, the actual abdominal pressure drops significantly, often far below the preset 15 mmHg, sometimes only around 8 mmHg. In other words, the real working pressure is just 8 mmHg. So, to achieve the same effect as before, we often ask the anesthesiologist to add more muscle relaxant. Usually, one more dose is needed. In extreme cases, up to 3 doses, 3 times the previous amount. This is not a rare occurrence. However, even as this doctor said, compared with the past, when there was no consistency evaluation, you must admit that the quality of drugs in China has significantly improved after the implementation of consistency evaluation. Next, in 2018, China established the National Healthcare Security Administration. After its establishment, it faced the issue of controlling medical expenses. Why control costs? Because people in China often say that medical care is both expensive and difficult to access. One key factor behind high costs is the high price of drugs. As we saw from the aspirin example, it's not just aspirin. Both original drugs and generics are expensive in China. For example, Pfizer's drug Lipitor. During its patent protection period, it cost $160 per box. After the patent expired, its price in the US dropped to $10. But in China, it's still sold for over 100 RMB more expensive than in the US. Why? Because there is little competition in China, allowing companies to set high prices. This is for original drugs. Generic drugs are even more outrageous. As mentioned earlier, Bayer sells aspirin in the US for 3 cents. But generic aspirin in China can be more expensive than Bayer's original drug in the US. Is that reasonable? Obviously not. Why are Chinese generics so expensive despite lacking technical complexity? The reason is simple: sales with kickbacks. This means money is distributed to doctors, hospitals, hospital administrators, and intermediaries. Although the retail price of generics is very high, the relationship between factory price and retail price is typically around 1:10. That means a drug that costs 1 yuan at the factory ends up costing 10 yuan for the patient, a tenfold markup. This margin is even higher than that of luxury products like Mutai. And this isn't even the full profit margin, this is just the factory price. The pharmaceutical company itself may already have a 90% margin at the factory level. Then, from factory price to retail price, there is another 90% increase. How is this distributed? First, doctors take a cut. There is a whole industry of pharmaceutical representatives who track prescriptions, what drugs doctors prescribe each month. At the end of the month, they deliver envelopes of cash. The average kickback rate is about 30%, as reported by The Lancet. In practice, it ranges from 20% to 40%. Traditional Chinese medicine tends to have higher kickbacks. Western medicine is lower. Original drugs have fewer kickbacks, but they still exist. Otherwise, doctors won't prescribe them. In addition, hospitals receive benefits. In the past, there was a system called supporting hospitals with drug sales. Public hospitals lacked sufficient funding, so drugs were marked up by 15%. Later, this markup was banned. But pharmaceutical companies still provide benefits to hospitals. To get a drug into a hospital, you must deal with the pharmacy, department heads, and hospital leadership, including the hospital director. To manage this system, companies also need sales teams, pharmaceutical representatives, and distribution companies. So you can see that the high price of drugs in China is not due to high production costs, but due to excessive costs in the sales process. You can verify this by looking at financial statements of listed companies. Many generic drug manufacturers report sales expenses as high as 70% to 80%. That's why drug prices are high, because of unreasonable spending. Some may ask, if doctors take kickbacks, why not prosecute them? Why focus on drug prices instead? The answer is simple. It's impossible. Too many doctors in China accept kickbacks. If you arrested them all, the healthcare system would collapse. A few years ago, I heard a story. In a provincial capital hospital, a pharmaceutical representative was arrested and exposed all the orthopedic doctors, especially senior specialists. According to the law, they should all have been sentenced. But then, the hospital would no longer be able to perform orthopedic surgeries. Later, when a senior official needed surgery, only a single note was enough to release all those doctors. So if laws were strictly enforced, most doctors in China would have to be arrested. This is systemic corruption that cannot be easily resolved. Facing this situation, how did Chinese government do to deal with this problem? Can they really fix it? Please leave your comment down below. And please subscribe and like. We will bring you the update in the next video.